The day Pearl Underwood fired a warning shot over the heads of 3 cattle thieves and sent them riding hard toward the horizon was the same day Cecil Redmond rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, with nothing but a saddlebag, a Winchester rifle, and the kind of quiet that follows a man who has seen too much of the world and liked very little of it. The year was 1882, and Dusty Creek sat at the edge of everything, wedged between the Santa Fe Trail and the sprawling ranchlands that men fought over with the same ferocity they once reserved for the war that had torn the country in two a generation earlier. It was not a beautiful town. It had a saloon that doubled as a doctor's office on Tuesdays, a general store run by a man named Elias Holt who was missing 2 fingers from a bad encounter with a saw blade, a church whose bell had cracked and never been replaced, and a livery stable that smelled exactly the way you would expect a livery stable to smell. What it also had, though most newcomers did not know it right away, was Pearl Underwood. Pearl was 26 years old. She stood tall for a woman of her era, with dark copper hair that she wore pinned up in the mornings and let fall loose by late afternoon, because no one was around to judge her for it. Her eyes were the color of creek water over slate, a gray-green that shifted depending on her mood and the quality of the light. She had her mother's jaw, sharp and determined, and her father's hands, calloused and capable. She ran the Underwood ranch alone, had been running it alone for 3 years, ever since her father, Thomas Underwood, died from a rattlesnake bite he was too stubborn to treat in time. Most of the men in Dusty Creek had, at one point or another, ridden out to the Underwood property with their hats in their hands and their best boots polished, thinking that a woman running 40 acres and a modest cattle operation must surely need rescuing. Pearl had sent every last one of them back down the road with a polite firmness that left no room for misunderstanding. She did not need their help. She did not want their charity. And she certainly did not need anyone to come along and take the reins of a life she had built with her own 2 hands. Cecil Redmond was 29 years old, and he came from the kind of past that men described in fragments, never the whole story, because the whole story had edges that could cut. He had been a cattle hand, a scout for the army briefly before the things he saw made him walk away from it, and more recently a drifter who took work where he found it and moved on before anyone could ask too many questions. He was not running from the law. He was running from something quieter and more personal, the specific kind of grief that comes when you have buried everyone you started out loving and are left uncertain what exactly you are supposed to do next with all that silence. He rode into Dusty Creek on a chestnut horse named Lasso, which he had won in a card game in Albuquerque, and kept because the horse had more sense than most of the men he had met since leaving home. He tied Lasso to the post outside Elias Holt's general store, pushed through the door, and asked for supplies: flour, dried beans, coffee, salt pork. He did not say where he was going. He did not say where he had been. He paid in silver coin and was almost out the door again when Elias Holt, a man constitutionally incapable of silence, cleared his throat. "You looking for work, stranger? Because there's a ranch about 4 miles east of town that's been short-handed since spring. Woman runs it herself, Pearl Underwood. Does a fine job of it too, I'll say that much, but she lost her last 2 ranch hands when the Calder spread started offering higher wages, and from what I hear the north fence has been coming apart since the last storm." Cecil paused at the door. He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds, which was longer than he usually thought about anything. "I'll ride out," he said. Elias Holt looked surprised, then pleased, then quickly cautious. "She's particular about who she takes on," he warned. "Don't go out there acting like she needs your help." Cecil looked back at the storekeeper with an expression that was almost amused. "I need work," he said simply. "That's all." Pearl was in the north pasture when she saw him coming, a lone rider on a chestnut horse moving at an easy trot down the dirt road that wound through the juniper scrub toward her property. She had her rifle on her shoulder, not because she was aiming it at him, but because she had been checking the fence line, and that was where she kept it when she was working alone. She waited. Her border collie, a young dog she called Moss because his coat was the color of dried grass, pressed against her leg and watched the rider too. Cecil reined in lasso about 20 feet from her and touched the brim of his hat. He looked at the rifle on her shoulder without flinching. He looked at her face. He saw a woman who was not afraid of him, which he found, unexpectedly, something close to a relief. "Pearl Underwood," he said. "That's right," she said. "And you are?" "Cecil Redmond. I heard at the general store you might be looking for hands. I've worked cattle and horses most of my adult life. I know fence work and water systems, and I'm not looking for more than fair wages and a place to stable my horse." Pearl studied him for a long moment. She had learned to read men the way some people read weather, watching for the small signs, the angle of the shoulders, the quality of the stillness, the particular way a man held himself when he thought he was being assessed. Cecil Redmond held himself like a man who was tired but not beaten, and there was something in his eyes, a steadiness rather than an eagerness, that was different from the usual. "What's your experience?" she asked. He told her. He was matter-of-fact about it, no embellishment, no performance. He listed the ranches he had worked, the names of men she might know who could vouch for him, the skills he had. He mentioned the army scouting briefly and did not elaborate. She noticed he did not mention anything personal, which she respected, because she did not mention anything personal either. $3 a week," she said. "You stable your horse in my barn, and there is a bunkhouse behind the main house that is clean and dry. Meals are your own responsibility unless I am cooking for myself, in which case I cook for two. I expect work to start at dawn and end when the work is done, which some days is well past dark. You have a problem with that?" "No problem," Cecil said. "One more thing," Pearl said, and she looked at him steadily. "I run this ranch. That means the decisions are mine. You do the work I ask you to do. If you have a suggestion, you can make it and I'll hear it. But the final word on everything is mine. If that is not something you can live with, then ride back to town now and save us both the trouble." Cecil looked at her for a moment that stretched a little longer than was strictly comfortable. Then he nodded. "That suits me fine," he said. Pearl lowered the rifle from her shoulder. "Come on then," she said, and she turned and walked back toward the barn, and Cecil rode alongside her, and the deal was made. The first weeks were straightforward. Cecil worked hard and quietly. He repaired the north fence line, which had indeed been coming apart at 3 separate posts. He redug the drainage channel behind the water trough that had been clogging with silt and causing the cattle to mill about restlessly in the mud. He reshod 2 of Pearl's horses with a competence that made her nod once approvingly and say nothing else, which Cecil was quickly learning was her version of high praise. They worked near each other and around each other without the awkward maneuvering that Pearl had grown used to from men who either wanted to take over or wanted to impress her. Cecil did neither. He did his work. When she gave direction, he followed it. When she was in the middle of something, he did not hover. She found, to her mild surprise, that having him there did not feel like an intrusion. It felt simply like having more hands, which was what she had needed and what she had asked for, nothing more. It was on an evening in the 3rd week, when the heat of the September day had finally relented, and Pearl was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun go down over the western mesa in shades of orange and rose that were almost offensive in their beauty, that Cecil walked up from the bunkhouse with his own cup and stopped at the foot of the porch steps. "Sit down," Pearl said, because it seemed rude not to offer, and because the sunset was the kind that deserved more than one witness. He sat on the top step, his long legs stretching out, his cup cradled in both hands. They were quiet for a while, which was comfortable. The coyote started up somewhere out in the scrub, and Moss lifted his head from the porch boards and pricked his ears, decided it was not worth the energy, and settled back down. "Where are you from?" Pearl asked eventually. It was not the kind of question she usually asked, but 3 weeks was long enough that it did not feel intrusive. "Kansas, originally," Cecil said. "Little town called Hardin. Most of my family is gone now. I've been moving around for about 6 years." She nodded. She understood moving around. She understood the way grief could turn you into a kind of tumbleweed rolling through places without taking root. "What made you stop here?" she asked. He looked at her, a glance that was brief and direct. "The work," he said, and then after a pause, "and I was tired." She looked back at the sunset. "I was born here," she said. "I have never left New Mexico territory, and I don't intend to. My father built this place, and my mother painted the shutters on the house the year before she died. I don't see how you leave all that." "I don't see how you stay when the people are gone," Cecil said quietly, not arguing with her but just honest, the way two people who have both known loss can be honest with each other without it being a wound. "The land stays," Pearl said. "The land is always there." He thought about that. "I suppose that's true," he said. They watched the last of the light disappear behind the mesa, and then Pearl stood up and said good night and went inside, and Cecil walked back to the bunkhouse in the dark, and neither of them said anything more about it. But something had shifted between them in the way that things shift when two people speak a true thing aloud in the same direction. October arrived with a sharpness in the air and trouble close behind it. A man named Harlan Calder, who ran the largest cattle operation in 3 counties and operated with the kind of casual, well-funded arrogance that comes from years of getting exactly what you want, had had his eye on the Underwood land for some time. The Underwood North pasture ran along the edge of the creek that fed both properties, and Pearl's water rights were something Calder needed if he wanted to expand his operation further south. He had made offers before. Pearl had declined every one of them. He had made threats in a sufficiently indirect way that Pearl could not prove they were threats. She understood the pattern. She had her own pattern in response to it, which was to refuse, to document, and to wait. What Calder did in October was send 2 of his ranch hands to tear down a section of Pearl's east fence in the middle of the night and push 40 of his cattle onto her land, allowing them to graze on her feed and churn up her pasture. When Pearl rode out at dawn and found the damage, she was furious in the cold, quiet way that was more dangerous than any shouting. She surveyed the torn fence, counted the strange cattle, noted the boot prints and the hoof marks, and went back to the house. Cecil had seen her face when she came in and said nothing, which was the correct response. "I need you to ride to town," Pearl said, "and find Deputy Dawes. Tell him I need him out here to document damage to my property before I move any cattle and before anyone can claim I've tampered with evidence." "I'll go now," Cecil said. "Tell him the Calder brand. He will understand what that means." Cecil rode to town and found Deputy Lucas Dawes at the jail, a young man of about 24 who was conscientious in the way people are when they know they are outgunned, but have decided to do the right thing anyway. He rode back out with Cecil, looked at the fence, looked at the cattle, looked at the tracks, and wrote everything down in his report book with great care. "I'll file this with the county sheriff in Santa Fe," Dawes said. "But Miss Underwood, you understand that Calder's lawyer will argue his cattle got loose by accident." "I understand," Pearl said, her arms folded across her chest. "File it anyway. Every piece of paper matters." After Dawes left, Pearl and Cecil spent most of the day repairing the fence and moving Calder's cattle back across the property line. It was physical, frustrating work, and by the time they were done, Pearl's hands were bleeding from the wire and the light was going. She stood at the water pump and washed her hands, and Cecil stood nearby, not saying anything but present in a way that felt like solidarity rather than sympathy, which was exactly the right thing to be. "He is going to keep doing this," Pearl said quietly, "until I sell or until he finds something that actually breaks me." "Are you going to sell?" Cecil asked. "No," she said, and there was absolutely no hesitation in it. "Then what can you do that you haven't done yet?" Pearl looked at him. She had thought about this. "I need to have the water rights officially surveyed and registered with the territory. I've been putting it off because of the cost, but if Calder's lawyer is going to argue precedent, I need documentation that predates anything he can produce." "How much does the survey cost?" "More than I have at the moment." She said it plainly, without embarrassment. Cecil was quiet for a moment. "I have some savings," he said. I don't say that as an offer of charity. I say it as a business arrangement. You pay me back when you can, with whatever interest you feel is fair." Pearl looked at him for a long moment. The evening light caught the planes of his face, the honest set of his jaw, the careful way he was watching her without pressure. She felt something stir in her chest that she had kept very carefully still for a long time. "I appreciate the offer," she said slowly. "I'll think about it." He nodded. That was all. He did not push. She went inside and he went back to the bunkhouse, and she thought about it all night. She came to him the next morning before breakfast when he was watering the horses, and she said, "I'll take the loan. Business arrangement only. I'll write up the terms." "I didn't expect anything less," Cecil said. She wrote up the terms, which were fair to a degree that almost made him smile, because they were fairer to him than she needed to make them, and he signed without reading them through twice because he trusted her. He gave her the money from the hidden pocket in his saddlebag, and she rode to Santa Fe the following week with the money, and came back 3 days later with papers from the territorial surveyor, and a look of quiet satisfaction that was the best thing Cecil had seen in months. The survey changed the character of the dispute. Calder's next visit to her property, he came himself this time, on a big gray horse, with 2 of his men flanking him, was received by Pearl standing on her porch with the surveyor's documentation in her hand, and an expression so composed it was almost regal. Cecil was visible in the background, working at the fence near the barn, not close enough to be threatening but present enough to be noted. Calder was a large man in his mid-50s with a silver mustache and the kind of smile that had too many teeth. "Miss Underwood," he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Calder," she said. "Before you speak, I should let you know that the territorial surveyor has officially registered my water rights along the North Creek boundary. The documentation was filed in Santa Fe last week. Deputy Dawes has a copy, and my attorney in Albuquerque has a copy." Calder's smile did not disappear, but it shrank. "You're a determined woman," he said. "I'm a prepared woman," Pearl said. "There's a difference. Is there something you needed, or were you just passing by?" He looked at her for a long moment, then at Cecil, then back at her. He touched his hat brim. "Enjoy the morning," he said, and he turned his horse and rode away with his men. Pearl watched until they were out of sight and then let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 3 minutes. She turned around and found Cecil standing at the porch steps, having moved closer without her noticing. "Well done," he said quietly. "Don't celebrate yet," she said. "Men like Calder don't accept no. They just change tactics." But she let herself smile briefly, which was something Cecil had not seen yet, and it did something to the air between them that neither of them commented on but both of them felt. November came cold and clear, and the work shifted with the season. There was hay to be put up and supplies to be inventoried, and the cattle to be checked for the respiratory ailments that came with the change in temperature. Pearl knew her animals individually. She knew which cow had a tendency to wander, which horse spooked at thunder, which steer was likely to cause trouble during sorting. She explained these things to Cecil not as instructions but as stories, and he listened to them as stories, with the attention of a man who finds things genuinely interesting, and he remembered every detail she told him. One evening in early November they were working side by side in the barn by lantern light, inventorying the winter feed. The barn was warm with the heat of the animals and smelled of hay and leather, and the specific domestic intimacy of a working ranch at the end of a long day. Pearl was up on the second rail of a stall, reaching for a high shelf, and the rail shifted under her weight and she lost her balance. Cecil was beside her in an instant, his hand catching her arm, steadying her, and for a moment they were very close, his hand on her arm, her hand instinctively on his shoulder, both of them catching their breath. She looked at him, he looked at her. The lantern light made everything amber and close. Pearl stepped down from the rail carefully, and he let go of her arm with a deliberateness that suggested it required some effort. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was entirely steady, which was impressive because she was not entirely steady. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "The rail's been loose. I should have fixed it last week." They went back to the inventory. But the warmth of his hand on her arm did not leave her that evening, and when she lay down that night, she found herself thinking about it in ways she had not thought about anything in a long time. The first real snow came in the second week of November, a dusting that turned the mesa white and made the ranch look like something from a painting. Pearl woke up to it and stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the light come up over the snow and thought about her mother, who had loved snow because it was so rare here, who had called it a visit from somewhere far away. She was still standing there when she heard Cecil knock at the kitchen door. She let him in and poured him coffee, and they stood at the window together, looking out at the snow. It was the first time he had been inside the house. "My mother called it a visit from somewhere far away," Pearl said, surprising herself by saying it aloud. Cecil wrapped both hands around the mug. "Where is your mother?" he asked, not cautiously but gently. "She died when I was 15. Fever." Pearl did not say it with grief exactly, more with the worn smooth quality of a grief that has been carried long enough to become simply part of how things are. "My father kept the ranch going, and I learned everything from him. He said the best thing a person could know is their own land." "He sounds like a good man," Cecil said. "He was," Pearl said simply. She looked at Cecil sideways. "What about your parents?" "My father was a farmer," Cecil said. "Good man, hard worker. My mother she was the kind of person who could make a Sunday feel like a celebration even when there was nothing to celebrate. She died in '78 and my father followed her about 6 months later. I think he just couldn't figure out what to do without her." Pearl looked at him. "That's a love story," she said. "It is," Cecil agreed quietly. "A very short ending, but a love story." There was a pause, and the snow outside caught the morning light and turned pale gold, and Pearl felt something shift inside her again. The same thing that had been shifting incrementally for weeks, moving like a slow river finding its new course. "I'll make breakfast," she said. "You might as well eat inside since you're already standing in my kitchen." He smiled then, genuinely and warmly, and it was the first time she had seen him smile like that, fully, without reservation, and Pearl Underwood, who had kept herself entirely intact and self-sufficient for 3 years through a combination of discipline and stubbornness and genuine competence, felt something that could only be described as undone. She made biscuits and eggs and they ate at the kitchen table and talked about the cattle and the fence and the supply situation for winter. And it was the most domestic morning she had had in 3 years, and she found that she did not hate it, which alarmed her slightly. Cecil noticed, because he was perceptive in the way quiet people often are. He noticed the slight tension that came back into her shoulders halfway through breakfast, the way she looked out the window more than she looked at him, the slight increase in the practicality of her conversation. He recognized it because he had the same impulse himself, the instinct to pull back, to remind yourself of all the good reasons to stay behind your own walls. He did not push. He finished his breakfast, thanked her sincerely, and went out to work. And Pearl sat alone at the kitchen table for approximately 4 minutes before she got up and went out to work too. December brought a development that neither of them expected. Word came through Deputy Dawes that Harlan Calder had retained a new attorney from Santa Fe and was making a formal challenge to the water rights documentation on the grounds of a procedural irregularity in the survey filing. Pearl read the letter twice, her jaw tightening incrementally, and then set it on the table and sat down. "What does it mean?" Cecil asked. He had been sitting across from her when she opened the letter, and she had, unconsciously, begun letting him be present for more of the ranch's business, not because she needed his guidance, but because talking things through with someone who listened without trying to take over was useful. "It means I need to go to Albuquerque," Pearl said. "My attorney is Nathan Briggs. He's handled property law in the territory for 20 years. I need him to look at this and tell me what we're dealing with before Calder's lawyer files anything formally." "How long would you be gone?" "4 days, maybe 5. She looked at the ranch around her, the cattle, the horses, the work waiting to be done. Can you manage it alone? Cecil looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. The gray mare needs her water changed twice a day, not once. She gets a film over it that makes her refuse to drink, and then she gets colic. The steer in the west pasture near the fence has been pulling at the wire. Check him every morning. The hay in the north storage loft is fine, but the south loft has a section near the east wall that smells off. I haven't used it yet. Don't start on that side. I'll remember, Cecil said. I'll write it down. You don't have to. She wrote it down anyway, a whole page of notes, precise and thorough, and handed it to him the morning she left. He took it and folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, and she rode out on her bay horse in the early gray light, and he stood in the yard and watched her go, and the feeling that came over him standing there in the cold morning watching her horse disappear down the road was one he had not felt in a very long time and could not immediately name. Pearl was gone 5 days. She came back on a Friday afternoon, looking tired and resolute. Briggs had examined everything and confirmed that Calder's challenge was based on a genuine technicality, a stamp in the wrong sequence on the original filing. It was fixable, but it required a return trip to Santa Fe with specific amended documentation, and it needed to happen before the new year or Calder's lawyer could escalate the challenge. It was a complication. It was not a defeat. She came back to find the ranch in perfect order. The gray mare was watered and healthy. The problematic steer was fine. Even the bunkhouse had been cleaned, which she had not asked for. Cecil was in the south pasture with the cattle when she rode in, and he saw her coming and walked over to meet her as she dismounted. How did it go? He asked. She told him. She was brisk and factual about it, the way she always was, but he could see the weariness under the composure, the specific tiredness that comes from fighting the same fight over and over again from a position that should not require fighting. The amended filing is doable, she said. I just need to go back to Santa Fe in January. I'll go with you, Cecil said. Pearl looked at him. You don't need to. I know, he said. I want to. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. She was going to say she did not need company, which was true but not entirely the point he was making, and she knew it. We'll see, she said, which was as close to agreement as she was going to get right now, and they both understood it as such. She took her horse to the barn and unsaddled her and brushed her down, and Cecil worked beside her without being asked, taking the bridle and hanging it properly, refilling the water, moving with the comfortable economy of a man who knew this barn now almost as well as she did. They worked in easy parallel, the lantern swaying slightly in the draft from the barn door, and Pearl found herself thinking, not for the first time, that this was what she had not known she was missing, not someone to run things for her, but someone to stand next to her while she ran them. She did not say any of this, but the thought sat in her chest, warm and stubborn, like an ember that refuses to go out. The week before Christmas, a small thing happened that cracked something open between them. Pearl had been sick for 2 days, a winter cold that had settled in her chest and made her voice rough and her temper short. She had refused to stop working the first day, which Cecil recognized was non-negotiable, and he had simply worked alongside her and said nothing about the fact that she was clearly miserable. On the second day she got up at dawn and felt dizzy coming down the porch steps and sat down on the bottom step and stayed there, which was so unlike Pearl that the dog Moss sat down beside her and pressed his whole body against her leg in alarm. Cecil came out of the bunkhouse at dawn, saw her sitting on the step and came over. He crouched down and looked at her face, which was pale and drawn. "Go back to bed," he said. "The cattle need—" "I will handle the cattle," he said. "Go back to bed, Pearl." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formality of her last. She noticed it, and it did something strange to her, the warmth and the directness of it. She was too tired and too sick to make it mean less than it did. "The gray mare, I know about the gray mare," he said, and he stood up and held his hand out. She looked at his hand for a moment. Then she took it, and he pulled her gently to her feet, and she went back inside without further argument, which was so unlike her that she thought, lying back down in her bed, that she must really be ill. She fell asleep to the sounds of Cecil working in the yard, the familiar sound of the water pump, the low voices of the cattle, and she slept for 4 hours in the middle of the day for the first time in years. When she woke up, there was a tin cup of broth on the table beside her bed, still warm, and she lay there looking at it for a long moment before she sat up and drank it. It tasted like salt and beef and something that might have been sage, and it was the most thoughtful thing anyone had done for her in 3 years. She got up by mid-afternoon, feeling better though still not well, and found Cecil in the yard splitting wood for the stove. She stood in the doorway of the house and watched him work for a moment, the methodical swing of the axe, the clean split of the wood, the breath rising in the cold air. "Thank you," she said, "for the broth." He looked over at her. "It was just broth," he said. "It was not just broth," she said, and her voice was still rough from the cold, but it was completely clear and he heard exactly what she meant. He set the axe down. He looked at her across the yard, and the look that passed between them was the kind that cannot be taken back or pretended away. It was not a declaration. It was not a gesture. It was simply two people looking at each other without the masks they had been wearing, just for a moment, just long enough for both of them to see what was there. Then Pearl said, "I'll make dinner tonight," and went back inside. And Cecil stood in the yard for a moment, the axe in his hand and the cold air all around him, and he felt something settle into place inside him, quiet and steady and certain, like a door swinging gently closed on everything that had gone before. Christmas that year was a quiet affair in Dusty Creek. Pearl and Cecil had fallen into the habit of eating dinner together in the evenings, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes on the porch if the evening was mild enough, and they had somehow never stopped. It had evolved so gradually that there was no single point at which either of them had decided to do it, which was part of why it had been allowed to continue. It was just the way the evenings went. On Christmas Eve, Pearl made a proper dinner with what she had: a chicken from the yard, roasted with dried herbs, potatoes from the root cellar, cornbread. She put a candle on the kitchen table, not because she was trying to make it romantic, but because the kerosene lamp was giving trouble and the candle was simply more light. She set 2 places. Cecil came in from the bunkhouse with his hair combed and his jacket on, which made her smile because she could see he had made an effort. And she found that she had made an effort too. She had worn her good dress, the dark green wool one that had been her mother's, altered to fit her, and left her hair down. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her and the candle-lit table and said, "This is beautiful." And she could tell he meant the table and also more than the table. "Sit down," she said, and her voice was steady and warm. "It's just chicken." "It's not just chicken," he said, and he sat down. They ate slowly and talked easily, the kind of conversation that goes from practical to philosophical without noticing the transition, from the winter grazing plan to the question of what the territory would look like in 10 years, from water rights to the memory of the best meal each of them had ever eaten, which for Pearl was her mother's tamales at a Christmas many years ago, and for Cecil was a simple meal of beans and bread that a Navajo family had shared with him once when he was cold and lost on the plain, and they had not needed to help him but did. "They were kind to you," Pearl said. "They were extraordinarily kind," Cecil said. "And I have thought about it many times since, the ease of it. They didn't make a ceremony of the kindness, they just included me, as though it were the obvious thing." Pearl looked at him across the candle. "You have that quality too," she said quietly. "The ease of it." He looked at her carefully. "You mean in how I work?" "I mean in everything," she said. She was looking at the candle now rather than at him. "You don't make a person feel managed. You don't push, you just stay." There was a silence, not uncomfortable but full. The candle flame wavered in some small current of air. "Pearl," Cecil said, and his voice was very quiet and very deliberate. She looked at him then. "I am not going to make this into something you feel you have to manage," he said. "And I am not going to say things I can't take back unless you are ready to hear them. But I want you to know that this," he gestured at the table, at the space between them, at all of the weeks that had brought them here, This is not casual for me. It has not been casual for some time." Pearl's hands were still on the table, and the candlelight moved across her face, and she was quiet for a moment that was measured in heartbeats rather than seconds. "I know," she said finally. "It is not casual for me either." He let out a breath slowly. "All right then," he said. "All right," she said. And they did not lunge across the table at each other or make any sudden declarations, because they were not those kinds of people, but something had been named that had been going unnamed for weeks, and naming it was enough for now. They finished dinner and washed the dishes together, standing at the basin, their hands occasionally close in the water, and when Cecil left that night he paused at the porch and she paused at the door, and he took her hand, just her hand, simply and warmly, and held it for a moment. "Merry Christmas, Pearl," he said. "Merry Christmas, Cecil," she said. He let go and walked back to the bunkhouse in the cold Christmas Eve night, and Pearl stood in the doorway and watched him go, and she was smiling in the dark in a way that no one could see, which was fine, because it was entirely for herself. January arrived sharp and deliberate, and Pearl's second trip to Santa Fe happened, and Cecil rode with her, and nobody argued about whether that was the plan because it simply was. They rode together, which was a full day's ride, camping one night in a sheltered draw near a bend in the river. The night was cold, and the stars were extraordinary, the kind of winter stars that are so numerous and so bright they look like a lie. They sat by the fire after dinner, close enough to share the warmth. Pearl was watching the flames and Cecil was watching the stars, and occasionally one of them would say something and the other would respond, and the pauses in between were as comfortable as the words. "Tell me something I don't know about you," Pearl said. Cecil considered. "I can read Spanish," he said. "I taught myself from books when I was 15. I thought I wanted to go to Mexico. I never did. Why didn't you?" "One thing led to another," he said. "The way it does." He looked at the fire. "Tell me something I don't know about you." Pearl was quiet for a moment. "I almost sold the ranch 2 years ago," she said. "Right after my father died. A land buyer came through and made a reasonable offer, and I sat with it for 3 weeks. I got as far as picking up the pen to sign the papers." "What stopped you?" "I walked out to the north pasture the morning I was going to sign," Pearl said. "And the light was coming up over the mesa, and the cattle were grazing, and I could hear the creek, and I thought my father dug that well himself. He dug it by hand over 2 weeks, just him and a shovel. And I thought, if I sign these papers I am selling the well my father dug with his bare hands, and I put the pen down and I never picked it up again." Cecil looked at her. The firelight moved over her face, the strong line of her cheekbone, the slight softness around her mouth that appeared when she was not actively guarding it. "I'm glad you put it down," he said. "Me too," she said quietly. They sat in the firelight until it was late, and when it was time to sleep Pearl lay on her side wrapped in her bedroll and looked at the fire and thought about how strange and good it was to be here, in the middle of the plain under the winter stars, not alone. She had been fine alone. She had been genuinely fine, but this was better. Santa Fe was a revelation to Pearl in the best way. The city had grown considerably since she had last been, and the territorial government offices were formal and imposing and slightly intimidating. But Nathan Briggs, her attorney, was a steady man who knew the law thoroughly, and with the amended documentation properly in hand, the filing was corrected and stamped and officially recorded in a process that took most of a morning, and felt anticlimactic given the weeks of worry that had preceded it. Standing on the steps of the government building afterward with Cecil beside her, Pearl felt something release in her shoulders that she had been carrying for months. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Cecil agreed. She looked up at him, squinting a little in the bright January sun, and on an impulse that surprised her she reached over and took his hand, and he took hers back, and they stood there on the steps of the territorial office in Santa Fe holding hands like the most natural thing in the world. They walked through the city that afternoon and Pearl let herself be a tourist for once. She looked at the things in the shop windows, the fabrics and the books and the silver jewelry, and Cecil walked beside her and bought her a coffee at a little shop near the plaza that sold it in the Mexican style, strong and sweet, and she drank it standing in the winter sunshine, and thought she could not remember the last time she had felt this uncomplicated kind of happiness. "Look at that," she said, pointing at a bookstore window where a stack of dime novels was displayed beside a handwritten sign advertising the latest frontier adventures. "The West is very popular with people who have never been here," Cecil observed. Pearl laughed, a real laugh, full and sudden, and Cecil looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, but which made the laugh go on a moment longer. That evening, in the hotel where Pearl had taken a room, they sat in the small lobby near the fire and talked until the desk clerk began to yawn conspicuously. And when Pearl went up to her room and Cecil went to his, he stopped her in the corridor and said, "Pearl," and she turned, and he kissed her softly, briefly, his hand coming up to cup her jaw with a gentleness that made her breath catch, and then stepped back. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said, and her voice was steady but her pulse was not, and she went into her room and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands to her face and smiled like a girl, which she had not done in a very long time. They rode home the next day through clear, cold air, and the mesa came into view in the distance as the afternoon began to lean toward evening, and Pearl felt it as a homecoming in the fullest sense, the land, familiar and beloved, and beside her a man who was becoming familiar and beloved in a different way, which was no less real. February on the Underwood ranch was the quietest month, the deepest into winter, when the cattle needed steady tending, and the days were short and the evenings were long. Cecil had moved his few belongings from the bunkhouse to the house proper at Pearl's suggestion one evening in late January, delivered with complete matter-of-factness. "You're spending more time in the kitchen than the bunkhouse anyway, and it's wasteful to heat two buildings," which was true, and also not entirely the point, and they both knew it. He took the small room at the back of the house that had been a storage room and cleared it out and put his things in it, and Pearl did not examine too carefully the quality of her own satisfaction at hearing another person moving around in the house at night. February was when they fell into something that could only be described as love, properly and without reservation, the kind that settles rather than flares, that has weight and texture and a specific sound, like the sound of two people who know each other well enough to be quiet. They spent their evenings reading by the fire. Pearl had a small collection of books that she read carefully and repeatedly, and Cecil had brought two books in his saddlebag, one a history of the Mexican War and one a collection of poems that surprised Pearl when she saw it. "You read poetry," she said, picking it up. "Don't sound so shocked," he said, not looking up from the page. She sat across from him and opened it to the middle and read for a while and then said, "This one." She read a few lines aloud, a poem about patience and the nature of returning to familiar places, and he looked up from his book and listened, and when she was done they looked at each other, and something passed between them that had no name in any language Pearl had studied, but was entirely legible. One evening Cecil was working at the table on a repair to the bridle, the oil lamp close beside him, his head bent over the leather, and Pearl was washing dishes at the basin, and without preamble she said, "Cecil." "Yes," he said, without looking up. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to let me say it without responding right away." He put the bridle down and looked at her. "I have spent the last 3 years being entirely sufficient," she said. "And I am, that has not changed." She turned from the basin and looked at him directly. "But being sufficient alone and being this are not the same thing, and I find I prefer this." She stopped. Then more quietly, "I find I love this. I find I love you, and I am terrified of that in the specific way that is terrifying because it is true and not because it isn't." Cecil was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be almost unbearable, and then he stood up from the table, and he crossed the kitchen, and he took her face in both his hands and kissed her with such complete honesty and tenderness that Pearl, who did not cry over things, felt her eyes sting in a way that was not remotely embarrassing. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I have loved you since you were standing in that north pasture with a rifle on your shoulder, and you looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth your time." Pearl pulled back just enough to look at him. "What was the verdict?" she said. "I think you kept me on," he said, and she laughed and kissed him again. Spring came to the Underwood ranch like a promise being kept. The mesa turned colors in March that moved Pearl to stand and stare at it sometimes when she should have been working, and the cattle were thick and healthy coming out of winter, and the creek ran clear and strong with snowmelt. The water rights were officially, legally, unambiguously Pearl's. Calder had tried the challenge and it had failed, and his lawyer had been unable to find a new angle because there was none to find. He did not come to the property again. Pearl and Cecil talked about the future in the way that people who are genuinely considering it talk about it, not dreaming but planning specifically, practically, with the directness that both of them favored. "If we were to make this official," Pearl said one morning over breakfast, and she did not finish the sentence because the end of it was obvious and she was testing the air. "If we were to," Cecil said, watching her. "Then I need you to understand something clearly," Pearl said. She looked at him across the table with the gray-green eyes that he had come to know in every quality of light. "This is my ranch. It stays my ranch. I want your partnership and I want your love and I want you here every day for the rest of my life. But I need to know that is what you are signing on to, and not," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "and not a situation where that changes gradually and I find myself a guest in my own place." Cecil looked at her for a long moment. "Pearl," he said, "I rode into Dusty Creek with a saddlebag and a horse I won in a card game. I have no claim on anything here and I don't want one. What I want is you. The ranch is yours. It will always be yours. I would not have it any other way." Pearl looked at him. "You mean that?" she said. "It was not a question." "I mean it the way I mean everything I say to you," Cecil said, "which is completely." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Then yes," she said. "Let's make it official." They were married in Dusty Creek in April in the Crackbell Church on a morning that was so clear and blue it seemed almost to have been arranged. Pearl wore her mother's dark green wool dress, refitted and pressed, with a single yellow flower from the first spring bloom pinned at her collar. Cecil wore his good shirt and his best jacket, which he had ridden to Albuquerque to have cleaned and pressed for the occasion, and his boots were so clean they caught the light. The preacher, a round-faced man named Reverend Cole who had known Pearl's father, officiated with genuine warmth. There were perhaps 20 people in the pews: Elias Holt from the general store, Deputy Dawes, a few of the neighboring ranchers who had always respected Pearl even when they had not fully understood her, and several women from town who had watched the situation at the Underwood ranch with great interest and had been rooting for it in the particular way women root for other women. When Reverend Cole said the words that made them husband and wife, Cecil looked at Pearl with an expression so open and unguarded that half the women in the pews felt something shift in their own chests. Pearl looked back at him with the particular smile she saved for moments that were entirely real, the one that started in her eyes before it reached her mouth, and when he kissed her the whole room seemed to exhale. Afterward, there was a gathering at the ranch. Pearl had made food and someone had brought a fiddle, and the afternoon stretched into evening in the easy, generous way of good gatherings, with plenty of conversation and laughter and a few people dancing in the yard. Pearl danced once with Cecil because he asked her properly with his hand held out, and she danced like she did everything with her full attention, and a competence she had acquired by practice rather than by nature. Later, when everyone had gone and the yard was quiet and the first stars were appearing, Pearl and Cecil stood on the porch together, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting lightly against him. Moss was sleeping at their feet. The coyote started up out in the scrub. "Well," Pearl said. "Well," Cecil agreed. "That went better than I expected," she said. "Better than you expected," he said, sounding amused. "What were you expecting?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything I planned for seems to go sideways. This didn't." Cecil pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Some things work out," he said simply. She looked out at the dark mesa and the stars and the land that was hers, that had always been hers, that had shaped her and kept her and that she had kept in return, and felt the remarkable sensation of being entirely whole, not because of him, but alongside him, which was the correct way to be. They moved through the spring and into summer side by side, and the ranch thrived with two capable people running it. Cecil's skills complemented Pearl's in the practical way of people whose knowledge has been acquired through experience rather than theory. She knew the land and the animals and the water and the growing seasons in her specific valley, and he brought a broader knowledge of cattle management and horse training, and the kind of traveling awareness that comes from having seen many different operations and taken the best from each. They disagreed sometimes, not badly, and resolved it the way they resolved everything, by stating their positions clearly, listening to each other, and finding the logic. In June, Pearl was sitting on the porch in the early evening when Moss came and put his head in her lap, and she was scratching his ears and watching a hawk circle over the far pasture, and she said to Cecil, who was sitting on the step below her, "I think we might be expecting." Cecil turned and looked at her. The evening light was gold and the hawk was still circling and the whole world seemed to have gone very still. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Not entirely, but fairly sure." She looked at him with the calm, direct gaze that he loved. "How do you feel about that?" He took her hand, carefully and warmly. "Like the man who is holding your hand and feeling more than he can say," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "That's an acceptable answer," she said, and she smiled. By October, when Pearl was visibly expecting and moving a little more carefully through the ranch work and refusing to let this change what she did very much, which Cecil accepted because he understood her, the situation with the Calder ranch had been quietly resolved. Calder had died in August of a sudden illness, and his son, a young man of 30 who had grown up watching his father's ruthless method and wanted no part of it, had come to Pearl formally to apologize and to withdraw all claims and legal challenges. It was a brief meeting, almost businesslike in its decency, and when the young man rode away, Pearl stood and watched him go and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph, but simply relief and something close to compassion for a man who had grown up in the shadow of a father he could not respect. "It's over," she said to Cecil. "It's over," he said. "I'm glad it ended this way," she said quietly. "Without I'm glad." He nodded. He understood what she meant. The world had enough hard endings. Their son was born in December, a week before Christmas, attended by the town's practical nurse, a capable woman named Mrs. Garcia, who had delivered half the children in Dusty Creek over her 20 years of practice. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and when it was done and the baby was placed in Pearl's arms, the whole world contracted to the size of one room and the weight of one small human being who was impossibly new and entirely complete. Cecil came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression Pearl had never seen on his face before, a kind of fierce, soft wonder, as though he had been shown something that he had not known was possible. "Hello," Cecil said to the baby, very quietly. "I'm your father." The baby, indifferent to this introduction, wrapped one small hand around Cecil's finger and held it, and something in Cecil's chest went entirely undone. Pearl watched him, her husband, holding their son's hand in the lamplight, and she thought about the morning he had ridden up to the north fence with his hat tilted and his horse easy and his manner steady and straightforward, and how she had looked at him with the assessment of a woman who had learned to trust her own judgment, and how her judgment had told her this one was different. She had been right. "He needs a name," Pearl said. "He does," Cecil agreed, not taking his eyes off the baby. "I was thinking Thomas," Pearl said. "For my father." Cecil looked at her then, his eyes warm and a little bright. "Thomas Redmond," he said. "Thomas Underwood Redmond," Pearl said firmly, because the name carried history. "Of course," Cecil said, and he meant it, and she knew he meant it. Thomas Underwood Redmond came into the world 10 days before Christmas and lay in the cradle Cecil had made from good pine wood through the autumn evenings. and the Underwood ranch settled into its new configuration with the ease of things that were always meant to be this way. The following year moved in the way good years do, marked not by crisis, but by the accumulation of good ordinary days, by the growth of the cattle herd, by the progress of Thomas from a sleeping bundle to a small boy who toddled through the kitchen with Moss, now older and gentler, at his heels. Pearl taught her son the names of things on the land, the plants, the birds, the rock formations on the mesa that each had their own shape and history. Cecil taught him the horses, introducing him to Lasso first, the chestnut who had carried Cecil into this life and who was gentle now in the way of old horses who have found their place. Deputy Dawes had become a genuine friend, visiting the ranch every few weeks with the friendly reliability of a man who was always welcome. Elias Holt at the general store had stopped his matchmaking commentary because there was nothing left to match, and had replaced it with a genuinely warm regard for both of them. The women who had attended the wedding remained in Pearl's orbit as something that could properly be called friendship now, a thing Pearl had not made much room for before Cecil came, and she had begun to allow more of the world in. In the spring of 1884, Pearl found out she was expecting again, and this time it sat easier, knowing the shape of it, knowing the shape of everything. She told Cecil on the porch in the evening the way she told him everything directly and clearly, and he took her hand and said, "Good," and then said more than good, and pulled her close in the way she had grown so accustomed to that its absence would have been the strange thing. It was around this time that Elias Holt asked Cecil, one day in the general store, how a man who had spent years moving managed to stay in one place. Cecil was buying flour and coffee, the same things he had bought on the day he first arrived, and the question was asked in honest curiosity, not skepticism. Cecil thought about it for a moment, honestly, the way he thought about real questions. "The right place makes it easy," he said, "and the right person makes it more than easy." Elias Holt nodded. "You were lucky to find her," he said. "I was lucky she kept me on," Cecil said, which was both true and more complicated than it sounded. He rode back to the ranch and found Pearl in the north pasture, the one where they had first spoken, checking the fence line with Thomas on her hip, the boy pointing at things with great intention and commentary that was not yet entirely language. Pearl was talking back to him in full sentences, naming the things he pointed at: the juniper tree, the hawk overhead, the cattle grazing in the distance. In the patient, serious way she did everything. Cecil rode up and dismounted and came to stand beside her, and Thomas reached for him with both arms, and Cecil took him, and they stood together in the north pasture in the late afternoon light, the three of them, and Cecil looked at Pearl. She had told him she did not need saving, and she had been right. She had never needed saving. She had been able and strong and completely capable of running her life exactly as she ran her ranch, with precision and care, and a deep knowledge that came from years of paying attention. What she had needed, what they had both needed, was not rescue but presence. Not someone to solve anything but someone to stand beside them in it. He had not offered to save her. He had stayed. And she had allowed it, this staying, because she recognized in him the same thing he recognized in her: two people who did not need each other to be complete, but who were better, richer, more fully alive for the choosing. Thomas put both hands on Cecil's face in the specific way of small children who have not yet learned to be subtle about affection, and Pearl looked at the two of them, and the land stretched out behind them, the land her father had built and she had kept and would pass on, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a life that has not been given to her but built, piece by piece, decision by decision, fence post by fence post, and enriched by the presence of a man who understood exactly what he had been invited into. The second child, born in October of 1884, was a girl. Pearl named her Clara, for no one in particular, but because the name sounded like morning light, and Clara came into the world with her eyes wide open and opinionated from the first hour, which surprised no one who knew her mother. The Underwood Ranch, which had once been Pearl's alone and before that Thomas Sr.'s, and before that simply land waiting to become something, had become, through the accumulated weight of two people's love and labor, exactly what land becomes when it is properly kept, a place with character and memory and a specific gravity that made people want to stay. Cecil had been one of those people. He had ridden in tired and without particular direction, and had found, in the north pasture of a New Mexico ranch, a woman standing straight against the sky with a rifle on her shoulder and a dog at her feet, and the quiet confidence of someone who knows her own mind and her own land. He had not come to save her. He had not imagined for a moment that she needed saving. He had come for work and had stayed for love, and the love had grown in the way that the best things grow slowly, honestly, in the full light. On an evening in December, 2 years after their wedding, Pearl and Cecil sat on the porch the way they often sat in the evenings, the children asleep inside, moss old and slow and warm at their feet, the winter stars beginning to come out over the mesa. Pearl had her coffee and Cecil had his, and the night was very still. "Are you happy?" Pearl asked, not as doubt but as the simple question of a woman who wants to know. Cecil looked at her in the starlight, at the woman who had made him feel, for the first time in years, that staying somewhere was not a defeat but a choice, and that the choosing was its own kind of freedom. "More than I have words for," he said honestly. Pearl looked back at the stars. "Good," she said. "So am I," a coyote called out somewhere in the scrub, and Moss lifted his gray muzzle and let it drop again, and the stars above the mesa were the kind of winter stars that look like a lie about how beautiful things can be. But they were not a lie. They were simply the truth of the place, the specific truth of this land and these people who had found each other here, not by accident but by the particular combination of circumstance and character that is the only real alchemy the world offers. Pearl reached over without looking at him and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they sat that way in the winter dark, the two of them together, and the story of how they had come to be that way. A woman who needed no saving, and a man who had not offered to save her, was written into the grain of the land around them, into the posts of the fences they had built and repaired together, into the walls of the house that was hers and now also his, into the faces of their children sleeping inside. It had been a life, honestly and fully lived in the wild and particular beauty of the New Mexico territory, in the last years of a frontier that was already changing and would continue to change, making way for what came next. But here on this ranch, on this land, in this evening, it was complete. It was whole. It was exactly enough. Pearl drank her coffee and Cecil held her hand, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the Underwood Ranch rested in the quiet of a December night in 1884, full of everything it had been given and everything it had grown, settled and warm and permanent as the mesa that had watched over it all along. Inside, Thomas stirred in his sleep and made a small sound, and Clara did not wake, and Moss sighed deeply at their feet, and the fire was going in the kitchen stove, and somewhere out on the plain the coyotes were singing to the cold, clear sky. It had not been a story about saving. It had been a story about staying, and the staying had been everything.